And we're rolling.
Cannot hear you, Tarita.
Sorry about that. I am Tarita Johnson, Director of Calvin's Career Center. Welcome to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace. It is an honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sandra Upton, Vice President of Global Diversity Practices with the Cultural Intelligence Center. She is responsible for providing leadership and expertise on diversity, equity, and inclusion for clients across the globe. She has over 25 years of experience training and consulting with businesses, educational institutions, government agencies, and nonprofits. She has led the center's unconscious bias certification programs. She has facilitated trainings throughout the United States, Brazil, China, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Israel, Singapore, South Africa, and several countries throughout Europe. Some of you are represented on this call today. Without further ado, Dr. Sandra Upton.
Thank you so much, Tarita, and I am so glad to be here alongside a very distinguished panel, and I'm excited to moderate what I think will be a phenomenal conversation, an important conversation that I hope to contribute to, but also learn from. And so before I get into our content for this next hour, I'd love to have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll take it back over and keep us moving. So maybe we'll start with you, Shaquanda. You are muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
It says I'm not.
You're not now.
Okay. I'm just talking away. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks to Dr. Upton, her influence. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning or this afternoon. I am Shaquanda Gordon, and really excited to just be here and share some tips and tools and knowledge with you today. So thanks for joining.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shaquanda. Cordell.
Thank you, Dr. Upton. My name is Cordell Zachary. I currently work at Steelcase as Diversity Recruitment Specialist. From Detroit, a transplant here in Grand Rapids, and really excited to be on this dynamic panel with some awesome people in the community. So thank you, Calvin, for the invite.
So glad you're part of the conversation, Cordell. And Luis.
Well, thank you, and pleasure to be here with everyone. And like you said, it's so many heavy hitters in the industry. My name is Luis Avila. I'm an attorney and a partner at Varnum Law here in Grand Rapids, a Michigan-based firm. I also co-chair our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which is an internal committee comprised of attorneys and staff. So this is a topic that's very close and very dear to my heart.
Fantastic. So glad you are here, Luis. So speaking of diversity, it's clear that we have a very diverse group of panelists that will provide us with some diverse insights around, again, this really important topic. But before I began to ask the panelists some questions, I just wanted to kind of frame the conversation, right? So we know that today we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural intelligence. And what do we mean when we use those words? And so I want to start with some foundational definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. And Luis and Shaquanda and Cordell might even have some different definitions, and that's okay too. But when we think about diversity, right, we're really talking about, right, any characteristic that can describe a person. And when we think about it from an organizational perspective, it really is looking at representation, right? So when we talk about having a diverse workforce, we're talking about what does that representation look like? Is it diverse? Does it include diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation? And the list can go on and on and on, because there's so many things that are deemed as characteristics of diversity, but we're really looking at representation. And then when we move over to inclusion, it's this idea of, now that we have the representation, or assuming we have the representation, are we creating an environment that is creating fair and equitable experiences for every single person that is a part of that organization? Not equal, but equitable, right? So fair, giving people what they need, the kind of support that they need, and in particular, paying close attention to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, underserved, historically marginalized groups, right? And making sure that we are creating a place where everyone is thriving, and that's when we get into the inclusion piece, where everyone is thriving, where everyone feels a sense of belonging. And so what does cultural intelligence have to do with diversity, inclusion, and equity? And I would argue that it has everything to do with it, because when we define cultural intelligence, it is the capability to function effectively in any multicultural context, both domestic and international. Capability is a really important word in that definition, because it's about skill. Because we all know that we can be, when it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity, we can all feel like we want to be diverse and inclusive, and we can all be sensitive to diversity and inclusion, but neither of those guarantee that, one, we're going to take the necessary action steps, and that, two, that we're going to have the skills to be able to manage and navigate that diversity and inclusion. So we need to be diverse and inclusive and equitable in a culturally intelligent way. In fact, there's research that shows that diverse teams are actually outperformed by homogenous teams when those diverse teams lack cultural intelligence. And I want to say that again, because some people look at that and they say, well, if that's the case, then why do we need diversity? We do. It's critical, but we need to understand that just because you have diversity, if that diverse team does not know how to navigate and leverage that diversity, right, then they're no more effective than a group that is homogenous. So cultural intelligence really is the multiplying factor when we talk about trying to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable environments. I'm guessing some of you may be aware of the latest move by Glassdoor, which is a website that allows for employees to rate and review their employers. And just recently, they added a rating around diversity and inclusion, which I thought was pretty cool. So now employees get to evaluate their organizations not only on, general culture or compensation, but also how is that organization doing in terms of its claimed commitment to be more diverse and inclusive. And it's shaking things up a bit, highlighted a few organizations that many of us would recognize, and some fared well and others did not. But it is a reminder of how employees and prospective employees see this as a really important thing. And it is, in many cases, a deciding factor as to whether or not they want to come and work for that organization or institution. So the conversation is important. The work that we do is important. And with that, I want to now move to our panelists and ask them some questions around this. So the first question that I have, and I love to start with you, Shaquanda. So again, thinking about this whole move with Glassdoor, and then we go inside the organization. You know, a lot of organizations do a really good job of marketing and branding, right? They have the mission statements, right, and they have the hashtags. But we all know that the commitment is much deeper than that. So how do you assess if an organization is truly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Upton. So a couple of things. Having worked in this space for some time now, and just having worked in a couple of different industries within the Grand Rapids area, there are some key things that I would encourage everyone to do. First, check their social media. What is their social media saying? What do they have career pages, and are those career pages reflective of the culture? Do you see diversity in not just the marketing materials, but the posts that they have out there? Are you going out to their website and reading their social responsibility reports? That will tell you a lot. Do they have a diversity and inclusion report? If they do read that, that will tell you a lot. But the most important thing for me is to ask questions. When you are entertaining organizations, especially in the interview stage, I am not afraid to say, you know, what is your diversity makeup? How many women do you have in leadership? How many people of color do you have in leadership? Do you have a diversity and inclusion strategy? If so, what is it? All of those things that are near and dear to you in terms of diversity, ask the question. They will either say to you, yes, you know, we have it, and here's all the great things that we do, or, you know what, we're working on it, or it's work in progress, or no, we don't have it. And so then you have the information that you need to make some informed decisions about, is this a place for me? If they say we're working on it, well, what does that look like, right? And don't be afraid to ask the questions that you need, because it's important to have a level of reciprocity in every working relationship. And so if D&I is very important to you, and you need to work for an organization that is conscious around that and intentional around that, you have to ask the question.
Great answer. And Luis, I see you nodding, so I'm guessing you might even have some thoughts to add to that. Why don't you jump in?
Sure. Thank you. I think Shaquanda hit the nail on the head. You know, I often say with regard to diversity and how organizations represent their diversity efforts, that old adage of tell me what you boast and I'll tell you what you lack, right? So you go to these big splashy diversity websites and all over their social media about all the great things they do, but oftentimes, and I hate to call it out, it's just fluff and it's not real diversity efforts. Right. And I think your introduction, Dr. Upton, was great. There is diversity, there is equity, there is inclusion, very different things. And, you know, I have to say, even our own organization sometimes struggles with how do we do right by all three of these and increasingly recognizing more. So I completely agree. I think oftentimes asking the question, we see that with attorneys and law students that are coming to join Barnum. They're asking us now. It's not just, hey, how much do you pay? It's what's the makeup, right? And not only what's the makeup, but like Shaquanda said, what does the leadership look like? Do I have a path for success here? You know, do I see myself identified in the leadership ranks? And also something that we see a lot of, and that I think organizations are increasingly becoming aware of, is community involvement, right? What are you doing in the communities that you work in, that you live in, to support these efforts, to advance the needle, as it were, right? Because it's not just we recruit in law schools that have a diverse employee base or student base. It's also, are we empowering the younger generations to become lawyers, right? Are we helping at the pre-K, at the elementary, at the middle school level to help students that might not otherwise have a chance to get to the point to they can go to a law school and eventually join us? So I think it's having a well-rounded approach, and it's not just marketing the few things that you do.
Yeah, that's great. And Cordell, with you being a diversity recruitment specialist, you're on the front end, right? And so I'm sure you see those questions, you get asked those questions, and how do you respond on behalf of Steelcase, and what other tips would you provide for our participants?
Yeah, and you know, honestly, I wish the question was asked a little bit more. I get surprised that students don't really inquire much about it. And I think it's an important piece as you kind of think about where you want to navigate as a career pathway and what's your preferred industry or preferred company to work for. For me, we in our kind of postings that we do with jobs, we make sure that our DEI statement is clear. And also as a Black man, I try to make sure that I provide my like authentic perspective. You hope that other interviewees and other people that are recruiters are still having that same transparency. But yeah, I kind of agree with Louise and Shaquanda. There are going to be some key indicators to tell you if companies are truly embracing diversity and inclusion. It's going to be at your board of directors level. What does that look like? We just saw California enact that law to really regulate that. So I think that there's some things that are going to help regulate those things as well. But also Louise mentioned community efforts. You know, looking at that impact report, you know, looking at that CSR report, where are they spending their money? Is it quality education? Is it reducing inequalities? And I think if organizations are truly ingrained in the practice of diversity and inclusion, they're going to state that out. But if they don't, that's an indicator.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, Cordell, for you to say that you don't get the question as often as you would like, you know, and you look at Steelcase, a very large multinational company. And so I think about students that may be listening in, you know, if you're not asking, for those of you that may be near graduation and in the process of applying for jobs, ask those questions, you know, don't be afraid to ask those questions. They won't be held against you. And again, if it's something that's really important to you, that's something you want to know as you make a decision about whether or not that organization is a great fit. Fantastic responses from all three of you. Shifting a little bit and thinking about, you know, as we go inside the organization and we think about, you know, race specifically and racism, and we tie that to what's happening in the national culture, really globally. You know, racism is a problem across the world, not just in the US. We've definitely got our issues here, no question about it, but it's real everywhere. And so there's all of this talk and language now about becoming more anti-racist and creating anti-racist organizations. And I've got lots of thoughts around both of those, but I really would love to hear from our panel in terms of, first of all, how do you define anti-racist, and what would be some of the characteristics of an anti-racist organization? So maybe we'll start with you, Luis.
Yeah, thank you. So very timely question. At Varnum, we started a book club recently as a result of sort of the national discussion around race. And the book that we started off with was How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Ram Kendi. A great book to start a conversation on race and equity in the workplace, by the way. Had some very interesting conversations. But I got to tell you, as I was reading that book, which talks about how to be an anti-racist, and it identifies as being able to understand that equality is not dependent on a behavior of certain groups, right? Doing that puts a race above others. And when you're reading that, you're trying to understand and you're trying to play out the examples. I got to tell you, sometimes I got frustrated with the author because I thought, well, that's clearly not me. I consider myself not, you know, an anti-racist. I'm not a racist, but yet you start seeing some of these behaviors that are called out, and you realize that we often engage in those behaviors just as much as anyone. And the fact, by the way, that you are a minority, a person of color, in no way exempts you from this behavior, which we oftentimes tend to think it does. Right. And I think that that's one of the important things for us to remember, that you can't say these things, you can't think this way just because you come from the community that you're trying to protect. That doesn't exempt you. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
It does, and it's interesting. It reminds me of when he was here in Grand Rapids and he talked extensively about the distinction between, you know, I don't care what you say, you know, you can say a lot of things that may sound racist, but at the end of the day, I'm going to look at your behavior. So just like you may not say things that sound racist, but if your behavior or behaviors are racist, then that's a problem. So I think he has some really interesting thoughts around all of that. Cordell, what are your thoughts about how you would define an anti-racist, and how does that translate inside of an organization?
Yeah. I think Ibram X. Kendi is a brilliant man, and he talks about the opposite of racism isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. I think that rings true. Organizations now have this unique opportunity to engage in conversation that we've never been able to before, or it wasn't a priority. And a lot of our white counterparts, you know, we saw Robert DiAngelo talk about racial stamina and racial fatigue. And I think if you are truly anti-racist, you're kind of stretching that. You're engaging in conversations, having uncomfortable kind of realizations about maybe systemic things within your organization. So those are the anti-racist kind of behaviors, the ones that see a problem and act on it, not just talk about it, not just try to have a think tank, but what are we doing to really, truly change systems that have been barriers to marginalized communities? So I think that now in our organizations, it's time to really look at those allies to kind of come together and help those maybe marginalized communities within the workplace and help them achieve greater heights, to help them with development. So I think now COVID and some things that have gone on with social justice have really created this unique opportunity to do that.
That's great. And Shaquanda, I want to twist the conversation a little bit, kind of building off of Luis's comments and some of Cordell's as well, because I'm sure people that are listening in could maybe feel a bit confused when we think about how we've talked about racism, right, in terms of it's this idea of it's privilege plus power, right? So I can be prejudiced against you as a person of color, but I can't be racist because I don't have the power, right, to influence systems. How does that reconcile with some of the things that Luis said as he was kind of referencing Ibram's work and how we define racism and racism?
Yeah, so I'm trying to unpack that and speak to it. So for me, there's this fundamental understanding that we need to have as humans, particularly in the United States, but even across the world. We need to get to a place where we can recognize and appreciate the true essence of the makeup of this country. None of us came from here. We need to be able to reconcile that race is a social construct. So someone made it up. I'm not going to debate the purpose of it, whether it was for their benefit or for their privilege or not, but it was made up. And now the residual of that is that there are the haves and the have-nots. So when you get to a place where you're trying to undo something that's been in place for centuries, you have to be very intentional around recognizing that we're more alike than we are different. And if you are using race as a determining factor of who should have and who should not have, or you're using race, whether consciously or unconsciously, to make decisions and or assumptions about people, then that in essence is racism, right? Mm-hmm. And so and all of us do it, right? It just like Luis said, just because you're a minority doesn't mean you don't have stereotypes and have these, biases that you have in place. When I think about just an organizational construct and just unpacking power and privilege, there is this, if you are white, you have privilege, and it doesn't matter where you are on the socioeconomic status or where you are, financially, where you live, there is still always going to be an advantage given to you. Not just white people. There are other cultures and or ethnicities that, again, have a privilege over others just because of the place. So it is definitely something that is very difficult to unpack. And I think that if we had the answer, we would be out of a job, right? That's the goal, right? To get people to a place where we understand that the things that make us different are the things that make us. And how do we put these lenses on where we truly, organically have those D&E and I lenses on every day, and we're able to make those decisions in the business setting, right? When you go into a corporation, do you have the ability to interact and inquire professionally and respectfully to understand each other, to get beyond those biases, to get beyond the idea of racism and social constructs, et cetera? So again, I'm like Louise. I don't know if I'm answering that question, but those are the things that come to mind. Do we organically have our DE&I lenses on every single day? When our feet hit the ground in the morning, are we consciously thinking about what we say, how we say them, not because we're on an edge, but because we're truly working to be better in this space and be an anti-racist?
Yeah, and I think you make a really important point about if we're going to have courageous conversations and most importantly, move to real substantive and sustainable action and change, we've got to acknowledge the past and the impact and effect that that has today. There is a place for the conversation around who that dominant society was and decisions that were made in systems that have been put in place. About how even if I have a behavior that may be racist, at the end of the day, it's about impact. So if I'm still a minority in that environment, the impact of my behavior probably won't be nearly as significant as the impact of that's part of the dominant culture and has greater influence, right? So none of the behaviors are appropriate if they are racist, right? But we also have to look at bottom line impact, and we all know, based on extensive research, that underrepresented and marginalized communities often the impact is much more significant on those groups when we see racism and racist systems happening in our organizations. Microaggressions, right? We all know that that's a really big word that's been around for a long time, and we know it's something that's very real. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen it in the workplace and how you've responded to that? Maybe we'll start with you, Louise.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think that there's any one way to respond to microaggressions. Oftentimes it just has to do with personality, how you react to problem solving. I think for me, it's been very important in the legal profession, and I've seen microaggressions towards me many times over my career. For me, it's always been making the point that I'm an attorney first, and then I'm whatever else you want to label me as, right? Then I can be Hispanic, then I can be male, then I can be whatever you want, but I'm a lawyer first and treat me as such. And so when I have experienced microaggressions, to me, it's almost been this reaction of wanting to do better, quicker, better quality product, larger, whatever it is, to show that I'm not whatever label you're pegging me as, right? That I'm not going to be put in this box that you've created for me. As my career has developed, though, one of the things that I've found very important that I've seen that I think anyone in the workplace needs to recognize is you also have certain levels of privilege as you go on in your career, and you've got to be an advocate for when you see a microaggression, step in and help out, right? Be that voice. If somebody else doesn't feel like they can speak up because of whatever personality, where they are in their career, help them out, speak up and do that. And frankly, I've seen it happen enough times over my career to where I've seen real change. Oftentimes microaggressions, people don't really mean it. People don't know what they're saying. Oftentimes they mean it, and oftentimes they know what they're saying. But you got to call it out, and you got to be willing to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah, a fantastic point, because whether they mean it or not, to me, it always goes back to impact, right? So even if it wasn't meant to be, if the impact was negative, then we've got to address it. That's great, Louise. Cordell, what about you and your experiences with microaggressions in the workplace?
Yeah, and when I saw this question, it was a little bit triggering to have to go back to those instances or recall times. But I think being in the workplace, you learn that there's nuances to microaggressions. There's levels. It could be more covert. Personally, I've been on an elevator and walked right off, and the person is like in front of the elevator and they're startled, or turn a corner and they're startled by, maybe it's my height, but sometimes you think like, is it because of how I look or my swag or how I dress? You kind of think like, I wonder what triggers that. But some of them are more kind of explicit. I've had people, I've been on a Zoom call and I had a cup of like a cup or a red cup, and they said, "Oh, are you drinking lean, Cordell? What is that in your cup?" And then I'm drinking chamomile tea. And it's this kind of like stereotyping that you get. And really, what I've learned to handle them, I think when you're first in the workplace, you're nervous to confront it. You don't want to be the guy that calls out I'm being prejudiced against, or I'm being stereotyped. But as you learn, we do have power as minorities in the workplace. You have to confront it. You have to pull people to the side, like, hey, this is what happened to me. I didn't feel comfortable. Let's talk about it. And I think as I kind of progress in my career, I've become more comfortable with having those conversations. But like we said, it's about having conversations around that, how to correct behavior. Because I think a lot of times we let it go unchecked to not be a disruptor. But I think that's our role sometimes, to break systems, to break behaviors, and to address it head on.
That's great. That's great. Shaquanda, your thoughts?
So I look at it a couple different ways. Sometimes you can compartmentalize it, but ideally you want to look at it holistically. So I try to lean into my emotional intelligence in every situation where a microaggression happens. And I think our human instinct are two things: you either fight or flight. And so how do you address those microaggressions in a way that if you are going to fight, that you fight fair, right? Because sometimes you can not fight fair. And if you flight, if you run from it, how long do you stay away from it before you come back and address it? Because I do think that we have a duty and responsibility, not only as DEI professionals, but as also champions of our culture of trying to dispel microaggressions and all of those things. We have a duty and responsibility to respond to them. So how I respond to repeat offenders is probably going to be a little different than I respond to those who are genuinely interested, but they just didn't know how to bring it up. Mm-hmm. I've had the questions about, my hair. I've had the comments around, well, you just intimidate. You're intimidating. And I say, well, what makes me intimidating? So I ask the question, well, why do you feel I'm intimidating? Because, you walk tall and straight and you kind of have a fast pace about you. Okay, your perception, but is it that I'm intimidating or that you're intimidated by me? Because I can't make your issues my issues all the time. But if there is something that I'm doing that prompts you to display or share this microaggression, then I need to know about it. But if it's simply your opinion and one that is unfounded, then we need to have a conversation about that. I've gotten better at having conversations. The older I get, the more comfortable I am in my skin, because I think there is a miseducation around women, Black women, being Black in corporate America. And again, I can only speak to that because that's my existence, right? I don't know what it means to be a white female in an organization. I don't know what it means to be a Hispanic male, and I can assume, but I don't know. So my purview is always going to be from my existence in this space. So yes, I've had to respond to multiple acts of microaggression, and I usually try to do it without being in my emotions.
That's great. And I love what Louise said earlier, there's this idea of diversity fatigue, right? So we all can be recipients of aggressions, microaggressions, and we can all be perpetrators, right? All of that can happen on both sides of the fence. And if we happen to be where we get, like you said, those repeat offenders, that can get exhausting at times, right? Diversity fatigue can step in, and that's why I like that you talked about, Louise, earlier is so important. That even if it's not you, on the receiving end, but when you see it happening, the whole see something, you say something, right? But when you see it happening, you lift the of your peer, of your colleague, and step in and acknowledge, address the wrong, and talk together about how do we make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. So we all have that responsibility inside of our organizations. Tied very closely to microaggressions, right, is this conversation on unconscious bias. And, there's a lot of conversation around that today, and a lot of trainings are happening. What are your thoughts about how that happens inside of an organization, and what are some of the things that your organizations are doing to address bias? Maybe we'll start with you, Cordell.
Unconscious bias is something that we talk a lot now, especially when you talk about recruiting and hiring. Bias can come in many different ways: unconscious bias, affinity bias. And it's really realizing that it's prevalent, it's a thing, it's real, but then putting systems in place to mitigate that. So for example, for hiring for us, we have a specific evidence-based selection that we use that kind of takes away that unconscious bias at a lot of different levels so that we can get more talent and diverse talent through that funnel. Higher Reach does a great cohort around that. There's a couple organizations and companies that participate in that. So it's these specific kind of systems and policies that you put in place to mitigate that, because we know that it happens, we know that it's real. And personally, it's really just kind of checking yourself. It's going into an interview and saying like, I see this, maybe, you know, I'm alpha. So if I see alpha by alpha on a maybe a resume, I gotta say like, maybe, you know, affinity bias could be there. So what should I check? What should I kind of take a breather? What should I kind of pay attention to more as I interview or ask questions, or what's my tone or what's my posture? So I think it's two-pronged. It's having that kind of self-check of saying like, what do I need to check before I go into these certain situations, and how do I account for that? But also having these policies in the workplace, systems in the workplace, so that it can check for others and that it doesn't happen in certain processes like recruiting or hiring.
Yeah, and you're so right. That is one place where we see bias happening often, is in the hiring process. So many people don't get the opportunity because of bias. What are you seeing, Luis? And what are you seeing in terms of it happening? And then what are you seeing in terms of how organizations, maybe yours in particular, are addressing this issue?
Yeah, I think for us and for me personally, the most important thing about unconscious bias is being conscious about the fact that you have unconscious bias, and being aware of the fact that this isn't something you're going to fix today, tomorrow. It's something you've got to fix every single day, because you will continue to develop unconscious biases, right? So you've got to be able to address those. And I love the point that Cordell made when recruiting, and being aware of that. One of the things that we have at Varnum, we've created a diversity council where we have, it's a council comprised of community leaders. They're not all DEI professionals. Some of them are just leaders within their industry, but that counsel us specifically on our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the board, whether that's recruiting, retention, or community involvement. And what we had them do a couple of years ago is we walked them through our recruiting process. We shared with them our recruiting materials. And we said, where do you see some of this unconscious bias playing out, right? We're not going to see it, right? We're telling you, we're unconscious to it. And one of the things, a very tangible thing that came out, is they identified in our interview list, our questions that we were asking the attorneys interviewing students or lateral hires. One of the last questions was, is this person a good fit? For us, very seemingly, inconsequential question. All I want to know is, do you think that they fit the culture of Arnhem? Well, our culture is very homogenous, right? And so when you talk about, is this person the right fit, someone like me might not be a nice fit, right? And so they were very clear. They said, guys, you got to eliminate this. You might be stifling out folks that you might not otherwise want to. You want to keep them here. And so to me, that's a very small but very poignant example of a small thing that can make a big impact in terms of being sure that you're identifying your unconscious bias on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's great. And Luis, I would argue that that's not a small thing. I think that's huge because we hear it all the time. I actually wrote a blog a while back that's, it was titled "When Culture Fit is Code Word for Affinity Bias," right? So it is a big deal. And for you to acknowledge that and make the decision to remove that was huge, I think, in terms of creating a system that is bias free, or at least moving in that direction. Shaquanda, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I recently joined Spartan Ash. It's been about almost a month this week. And my role is over all things talent. So development, acquisition, OD, and then diversity. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years around talent and diversity is they are so interconnected. And when I approach this work, I'm not just looking at the recruitment stats, right? I do want us to increase our representation, but I also think you have to go a little bit deeper. I need to see who and how many people are we promoting. I need to see who and how many people do we have in our development programs, and what programs are being afforded to them. And I also need to see the turnover. Because I can increase my representation, but it's as I'm increasing it, if they're leaving just as fast, then we have not fixed the problem. If we have all of these opportunities for promotion, but none of our women, people of color, veterans, disabled are being promoted, we still have a systemic issue. Same thing with development opportunities. If the only people we're sending to executive leadership development and manager development are non-minorities, then we still have a systemic issue. So it's embedding that unconscious bias training across all facets of an employee's life cycle. The one thing that we're challenged with now, we now have this executive order that is coming down saying that, you have to be conscious of the words that you use in unconscious bias training. And you can't use things like systemic racism or privilege or power, like all of these words that we have grown accustomed to as we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity are now being we're banned from using those in a way that delivers training. When I think about it holistically, starting with our executives is the first step for me. I need to get them into a room so that we can have some open and honest conversations around what it means to them. I love the exercise. It's a simple exercise, Dr. Upton. I know you may be familiar with it, where you ask people, you have 2 minutes to talk about, what do you know about Asians? What do you know about Black people? What do you know about white people? And you ask that question, and I came to know all the biases I had, because some of the things that I would respond to are so stereotypical. And I was like, ooh, that was an uh-oh moment for me, right? But you start with exercises like that. At Spartan Nash, what we've done, so I do think there is a scientific way to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is it my preferred way? It depends on the situation, but there's this mindful behavior series that Steve Robbins presents. And so Steve is coming in and talking to our executives about this mindfulness, and then moving from mindfulness to unconscious bias. So it's really important around how you design for trainings around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lastly, I would say, how do you measure the impact of it?
Right.
That's the key. So we've done all of this wonderful training. We pulled you all in a room and said it was required. You sat through it, but did your behaviors change? Do we see these numbers changing and how we're recruiting and where people are falling out in the selection process? And are they being promoted? Are we keeping them, et cetera? So those are some of the ways that you measure that. And now we have Glassdoor that's going to be another indicator of how we are functioning as an organization.
Absolutely. You nailed it when we talk about, we can have all of the trainings all day long, but if we don't find ways to measure and develop skills so that those behaviors change, then we're running in circles. That's a great point. What do you, so I know, each of you, are in DEI and you're leading the work in your organizations, but what if you have an organization that's not quite committed to the work at the level that a Spartan Nash has? You're on top of Shaquanda there. I'm sure you've got a straight line to the president. It's not a dotted line with limited resources, right? You've got influence, but not every organization is there yet. So how do you encourage people to navigate in those environments, in those organizations, and especially thinking about perhaps a young college student that's going into an organization and it's clear they see a lot of other good things about the organization, so they make the choice to be a part of that team, but still it's not a top priority. How do they navigate in an environment like that, and what are some things that they can do to challenge change?
Shaquanda, question for me. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So one of the things I found is happening more, we do have those younger generations in the workforce where this is top of mind for them. And so when they get there and they don't see things that are designed for, i.e. young professionals, they come together on their own. They come together and they start getting together and it's very informal. And then all of a sudden they have the masses behind them. And so you kind of forced to say, okay, if 35% of my organization is under the age of 30, I probably better pay some attention to them, right? And so you couple that with the data. They have literally just taken the lead on this. A lot of the employee resource groups that have been birthed out of organizations has been because similarly situated employees or associates have gotten together and said, this is important to us. And here's our proposal on how we want to get together and make a difference in the company. Here are the things we want to see. So I would definitely encourage that route as a young professional, if you're looking for things to really connect yourself to an organization, that would be the first thing I would do.
Yeah, and I would say that that's also true in the education space as well. You know, students are rallying together on campuses across the country, enforcing change at institutions. So I think that can work across the board. Cordell, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely would. I think as a student, if I'm coming out of college, I would look at my kind of needs from an organization. Like, where does diversity, inclusion, and those type of welcoming spaces rank on your need for an employer that you're working for? You know, I would hope that it's high. And if it is high on your list, I would definitely go into the workplace and try to find a mentor. It's tough. It's tough for people of color because we don't have a lot of those at the executive level. But I was fortunate enough to have a mentor to really help me bounce ideas. If I'm experiencing microaggressions, then I was able to go and say, like, look, I need lunch right now. Like, let's go talk about this. This happened. And really try to find those allies and those kind of like cohorts within your organization to have these discussions. Just like Shaquanda said, like ERGs are birthed out of these kind of just these moments and conversations. And that's what's happening in our workplace when George Floyd was brutally murdered. That's when we had discussions with Black employees from New Jersey, from Phoenix, and I met other Black employees inside my workplace at a workplace I've been working for 4 years now, and I just have met some of these people. So I think it starts with those new kind of discussions, host forums, host meetings, and say we just want to come together and talk about this, and then that spurs maybe a petition or a coalition, and that spurs input into policy and input into decision making at the board of director level. So it starts very granular, but build up that team and start to come together, and you can really, the sky's the limit to where you can have influence and what that can build up to.
Yeah, that's great. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the ERG term, that stands for Employee Resource Group. So these are groups that form, it could be a group of females or people of color, but these are groups that come together to provide support to that particular culture group within that organization. Luis, any thoughts you want to add to this?
Yeah, you know, I'd answer that from two different perspectives. One from the business perspective, the organization's perspective. I hate to say it because it shouldn't be this way, but you've got to almost make a business case for why this is just a good thing for your organization. We all know that the future of the employee workforce is in minorities, right? This is an increasingly large section of any employee workforce, especially if you're talking about West Michigan or even across the state. So you've got to buy into the idea of DEI, whether you like it or not, because your employees are going to be asking for it. And by the way, they are increasingly asking for it. You know, in interviews, they want to know what your workforce looks like. They want to know what you're doing, but also because your clients and the organizations that you're trying to serve are asking for it as well. They're coming to you and saying, what are you doing, by the way? Because my organization believes in this. If I'm a Spartan Nash and I believe in this to my core, I want to know that everyone that I'm doing business with believes in the same thing. And by the way, not just because I think it's good, but because I want to push you, right? I want you to be challenged a little bit. So I think you got to look at it from that perspective. And then I love what Cordell said in terms of your employees seeking out allies in the workforce to try to advance it that way. And I'll tell you what, oftentimes what you'll find, especially if you're a student going into the workforce, I would encourage you to look outside of people of color. You will find a lot of allies that are not people of color that want to do the right thing, that want to help empower you. And I'm just going to say it, oftentimes people in a position of privilege are better placed to help you advance and to be that ally for you than people that are sort of struggling along with you. And I've seen it in my own career. I've seen it in a lot of my mentees' careers where they find an ally that's just, let's say it, they're white, that will help you along in your organization. So don't be afraid to look outside of your own groups.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity for that person that's in a position of privilege to demonstrate, right? If they can, because we can talk all day long, but if they claim that they really do value diversity and inclusion and equity and really do want to be a part of the solution, then it should be a no-brainer that they will step up and be an ally and an agent of change, and to use their privilege and power to create equitable experiences for everyone. And also building off of your other comment, Luis, I think you just nailed it when you said that this is no longer an option, right? And I use the language cultural intelligence, but I can promise you from the hundreds of universities that we work with around the world and the hundreds of companies that we work with around the world, it's an expectation, so it's speaking to the students that may be on the call. It is an expectation that you have this skill to be able to navigate effectively across cultures. It is not an option. And when you look at, so when you couple that with the changing demographics, and I remind people all the time, we don't have to wait until 2044, where things will really flip. But if we go back and look at 2011, when that was the first year that more brown babies were born, more Black babies were born than white babies, that was a major shift in society. If we look at today, and we know that students of color are the majority in our K through 12 public schools now. So those shifts have happened. They're just going to manifest themselves even more as we move forward into the future. And so it is not an option, but it is an expectation that we all have these skills to navigate across cultures. The other thing that you said, Luis, that I think is so important is this idea of making the case. And again, the part of the case is the data of what's happening now, what's happened in the past, and what's happening moving forward. But Shaquanda, I'm curious to know your thoughts about what other things are important to making the case for DEI in our organizations today. Shaquanda, you are muted, and hopefully we didn't lose you. There we go. We can't hear you for some reason.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
There we go.
It froze on me. Yeah, it froze on me. I'm sorry. I heard you say my name and that was it.
Yeah. So I was curious to know, what are your thoughts about, Luis had made the statement that, the idea of making the case for DEI, we talked about the data, and you heard me my commentary around the fact that it's not an option. But I wondered about your thoughts in terms of what are the other important parts of the conversation in terms of people understanding the importance of DEI?
Absolutely. So from a business perspective, there are some fundamental things that I found really help for it to take hold in an organization. So you have to understand the why, the business case. Why are we doing DE&I? Why is it important to us? And then once you understand that, again, your business case, you can then go in and say, what is it that we want to do? Because there's a lot of things to do. But what is it that we're going to do? What is going to be our focus, whether it's programmatic or is systematic? What is our approach to DE&I? And then how are we going to do it? What are those things? How are we going to communicate? What governance are we going to put around it? What metrics are we going to put around it? How are we talking to not only our talent and culture, but our customers and et cetera, right? So those are the framework of DE&I is absolutely critical to success and for everyone to be kind of on the same page around where are we moving? Are you taking a social justice approach, or are you taking a really holistic approach, right? All of those questions need to be answered in order for you to for it to take hold. That way you're speaking the same language across every organization, across all parts of the organization. So that has been something that is very important to me. And I've pushed that in every role where I had to come in and design a framework. And then again, really putting emphasis on board down. So I need board down participation in this. And how involved is your board is going to be a determinant. What are our goals? So we have the framework, but how are we measuring our success? Is it just around representation? Talk to me about how we're going to say, yes, we crossed the finish line, and now we need to move that finish line a little bit further out, because the work is never done in that space.
Yeah, that's great, Shaquanda. We are 10 minutes out, or a little less than that now, and we promised you that we would open up the floor for questions, and it looks like we've had a few come through. And so I am going to let Courtney jump in and run through the questions, and then I'll sort of jump in as a panelist and perhaps be willing to answer some of those questions as well. Thank you, Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation so far. And like Dr. Upton said, we do have a few questions, so I'm going to jump right into it and offer it up to Dr. Upton and our panelists. So the first question is, how should companies that strive to be anti-racist respond to President Trump's executive order stating diversity trainings cannot allude to systemic racism in the U.S.?
I think Shaquanda started to talk a little bit about that earlier, so I'm going to let her jump in and make some comments, and I certainly have some as well. But
listen, and I wanted to hear from you, Dr. Upton.
My short answer is there are always workarounds, right? So I think there's other language that we can use. I think, we cannot back down, I'm not talking about breaking the law, Louise, okay? But I think, there are ways to still have the conversation and to move in the direction, but it is too critical. It is too necessary. And so I think, that may challenge us to think again a little bit about language, but I think the goal will be to make sure that whatever language we use, that is still moving us in the direction of improving individuals' skills and changing their behaviors and changing our systems so that they create equitable experiences for everyone. So I think the mission cannot be thwarted regardless of the new policies, but we just may need to find creative and different ways of getting there.
Yeah. If I would add one other thing, so when the executive order came out, one of the first things that one of our major vendors did, Franklin Covey, they sent a letter out to say, we're in compliance with this. This is how we're going to handle it. So I will see, it's likely that most organizations are going to be leaning into their vendors to say, help us solve for this. Yeah. How are you going to redo your training so that they fit this? So a lot of the work won't be on the organization unless you do a lot of developing your training from within.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question we have, it says, I am a 60-year-old boomer, white male, and beginning to feel like I should not speak about anti-racism as I have not experienced it. What can I offer the conversation, or what is true allyism?
That's a great question. I'll let Luis or Cordell jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see this is very prevalent in the legal industry, right? Partners, leaders of law firms are almost all older white men. And I can tell you, I have found some of the best allies in the legal industry in older white men. I think you should be actively involved in the conversation. I think you should come at it from a perspective, the same perspective, frankly, that all of us do, which is, I don't know everything. I know a little bit, and I'll add what I know, and I'll just sit back and listen a lot. And being a true ally, I think, is reaching out to folks that you think might need some assistance, might need some help, might need your guidance, your advocacy, and speak on their behalf. Be a voice for them. Carry them along to the client meetings. Give them that good project to work on. Take them out to lunch. There's so much that you can do to help out. I think, frankly, the conversation sometimes devolves way too much into let's bash older white men. And I think that's the worst conversation to have. You are our allies, and you're absolutely a critical part of this conversation.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I agree with much of what Luis said. I think the worst thing you can do is to do nothing. And I think one of the first steps that you can take is to really educate yourself. And that, that's just, taking time to learn about why things are the way they are, right? How do we get here in terms of some of the inequities that we are experiencing, particularly people of color are experiencing, and other historically marginalized groups. How do we get here? So really taking some time to educate yourself and build your CQ knowledge around why things are the way they are, and then use your privilege, use your influence, use your agency to create change. And I'm going to use that systems word again too, because I think that's important. So it's great to take to take someone out to lunch, but it's even better, right, if you can create a space for them to grow in the organization and assume a leadership role. So do things that really do shift the tide in terms of people who aren't in positions of influence or power, and you have some influence and say in those kinds of processes, truly be an advocate. But the worst thing that you can do is to not do anything. And don't be fearful that, that again, you may not get everything right, but you learn and you keep moving forward. But absolutely be engaged.
Thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. Can you please share specific companies and or websites that allow companies to create and develop a diverse talent pool?
All right, I'll probably sound biased. Oh, go ahead, Cordell.
I'm sorry, Sandra. I'll let you go because I want to hear the secret sauce too. But yeah,
I would probably sound biased, but I think I really do believe very strongly that I think cultural intelligence really is so critical to this whole process, because it really is about you're not going to get people to change behavior if they don't. They need a set of skills in order to be able to do that. And so a lot of the work that we do, right, is definitely in this space where we are helping to develop those skills and helping to create change both at the individual and systems level. So certainly the work that we do can contribute to that, but there are others as well. And I'll let Cordell jump into that because he may have had some other thoughts.
Definitely. I think there's organizations and companies that help you on that journey. But really as an organization, I really challenge you to not look at the quick fix, like I can go to this job board or this specialty job board, post a position and expect diverse talent to be drawn to that. It really is about building authentic relationships with universities, HBCUs, Hispanic-focused universities, and also community organizations that work with talent from all types of spectrums. So it's really doing things, not only just showing up to the job fair, but also contacting the Multicultural Affairs Office and figuring out what other events. Is there a diversity dialogue event? Is there a student organization I can sit in on their meeting? So it takes a lot of work in really building those relationships so that it's not transactional, but a mutually kind of beneficial relationship.
Absolutely. I think we are at 1 o'clock. Wow, that hour went fast. So I guess I will pass it back over to Rita.
Yes, thank you so much to Dr. Upton and our panelists, Shaquanda, Luis, and Cordell. You guys were amazing. I just want to share with all of you that there's some great resources, the Cultural Intelligence Center. I do want to promote that because the work that Dr. Upton and her team does, they have lots of certifications. I just did a 3-hour unconscious bias training. So lots of great resources, as well as Grand Rapids Chamber. And I know all of you are from all over the world. So look at your chamber. They have an anti-racism institute that I'm participating in this Thursday and Friday. So you will get a resource guide that will have books, podcasts, other resources that may be helpful for you as you continue these conversations. I will also be promoting other events that we're having for Unlearn Week with our Intercultural Student Development Office. So look for my post on social media, but it will also be included in the email that I send to you. Thank you, everyone. This has been a wonderful event. All right. Well, thank you, panelists.